And again, I don't want to freak people out.
No.
But last night, one of my buyer's agents did a final walkthrough on a home, and the house had been vandalized. Hey everybody, welcome back to episode number 8 of Buying Your New Home. My name is Joe Maez.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Amar Neshwat with Frost Mortgage Lending Group.
Excellent. Well, welcome guys. In episode 7, if you tuned in last time and you watched episode 7, we talked about surveys and the importance of surveys, the different types of surveys. If you haven't watched that episode, go back and check it out. There's some good information. But this week, we're going to be talking about the week of closing. We're there. We've been through so much since episode number 1. And now in episode 8, we're talking about the week of closing and the importance and a lot of things that people don't really know or think about.
Absolutely.
If they don't have somebody guiding them down the path. So let's talk about the week of closing. Talk about, as a lender, from a lender side, what do you see?
So this is our favorite week. We have basically all of our documentation has been submitted. All of our loan documents have been approved. And we get what's called our clear to close, everybody's favorite 3 words.
Clear to close.
Absolutely. So at that point, when we have our clear to close and we've delivered a copy of the appraisal to the borrower 3 days prior to closing, another important piece of documentation that you'll receive is called a closing disclosure.
So also referred to as the CD.
CD is our terminology version of closing disclosure. So it's not compact disc.
Well, it's a different type of CD, right? But this is good terminology, guys, that we want you guys to really, really listen to, because a lot of this, this series is to get you educated on what this jargon means, like what does certain terms mean, right? And the CD is super important. I want Amar to really go deep into why the closing disclosure is so important. Go ahead. Why does it exist?
So the CD gives all the terms and conditions of the loan, along with your locked interest rate, your monthly payment, your closing costs, your cash to close of what you're actually bringing to the closing table. All of that will be visible on the CD, along with any fee associated with the loan itself. So a lot of people have those 3 days to review each and every line item and go over them with their loan officer 3 days prior to closing.
So Amar, tell everybody why a CD exists. Why does a CD exist?
The CD exists mainly because people need to view what they're setting up for, what they're getting ready for closing for, what they're bringing to closing, what they're signing up for. On the bottom line is, this is the house I'm buying, this is how much I'm paying for it, here's my loan amount, here's my monthly payment, here's my cash.
But in reality, the CD exists because of history, guys.
Absolutely.
And you guys, some of you may or may not remember 2007, 2008, what happened during that time.
That was meltdown. That was the mortgage crisis of the world.
And there was a lot of people and there's a lot of things that came into place, rules and regulations that came in to protect you, the consumer. That's buying a house, because a lot of banks and a lot of lending institutions were doing a lot of fraudulent stuff, putting in, hidden fees and costs that you as a borrower wouldn't know. You wouldn't know. You're just like, hey, I'm happy I'm getting my house. I'm closing today. Yippee. But little did you know that there may have been $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 worth of fees that you were paying.
Absolutely.
Right. And a lot of people got, the
pretty
term that I'm
forced.
Yeah. The term that I'm going for. I mean, so that's why the CD exists. And, great lenders like Amar are going to walk you through the CD and have a very transparent conversation. Okay, so that's one thing that happens during the week of closing, because you don't want to be doing that last minute, because what happened in the past is a lot of people would get disclosures the day of closing.
Absolutely.
And at that point in time, it's kind of like you had a gun held to your head.
Yeah, you're forced to close regardless, whatever you see.
You have all this stuff squared away, and all right, so let's talk about, so you got that.
So you have your CD and you got your clear to close, you got your CD delivered to your email. Fortunately, everything can be e-signed now through our secure portals. So things can be delivered through email, whether you're in California, across the world, doesn't matter where you are, you're able to view and sign your CD 3 days prior to closing.
So on the real estate side of things, meanwhile, back at the Maez Group, On the real estate side of things, some other things are happening. During the course of the transaction, maybe there were some repairs that were negotiated. Maybe there was, a lot of things that happened during the negotiations. We're going to schedule re-inspections to go back and re-inspect the property to make sure those repairs were indeed done, right? So that way you can go to closing. So during the week of closing, a lot of these re-inspections are occurring. Or there's invoices or bids for certain credits that maybe the seller is going to give you because, this day and age, contractors are in short supply, and let's face it, a lot of people don't want to show up to work. They say they're going to show up, they don't show up, they don't deliver. That's just the nature of the beast. So sometimes it's a little bit easier for a seller to give the buyer a credit at closing.
Absolutely.
To be used for those repairs down the road. So as real estate professionals, we're lining those things up. We're making sure that those invoices are to title so they get paid out. Okay.
Absolutely.
So some other things that we want to talk about, and guys, these are all things that, believe me, I've seen so many bad cases of people that don't have a system when it comes to the week of close. Here's some other things that you probably need to do. What's going to happen this week? After this week, there's going to be a change of ownership.
Oh, yeah.
So it might be a good idea to get your utilities changed over as well.
Absolutely.
So don't wait until the day of closing, because a lot of times sellers, if you're supposed to close on the 30th of the month, that seller is going to turn off the utilities on the 30th of the month, regardless of whether there's an extension, or anything like that.
And God forbid it's on a Friday, then we know that happens.
And if it happens on a Friday, they're going to turn off the utilities, water, gas, electric, things like that. There's nothing worse than closing. So the week of closing, you need to be making the calls. And of course, our office will call you and remind you about those items, but it's truly your responsibility. Your real estate agent cannot make those calls for you because you need to set up an account. And the reason we want you to have them transferred into your name is because there's things called reconnection fees. So if there is a termination in the service, so let's just say your gas and electric is turned off and you forgot to change over your utilities. Well, you may have to wait a week for somebody to come out, and they may have to test the gas lines or get things squared away for you. All right. Yep. So you got to think about all these things, guys. And of course, that's part of what this is all about. It's about reminding you and preparing you for what reality really is. Okay.
Absolutely.
What is something else, Amar?
So another huge part of it is going to be the appraisal valuation form. So 3 days prior to closing, you as a consumer, as a borrower, have every right to view the appraisal that was ordered on your behalf. And the appraisal, like we talked about in a previous episode, always is basically the collateral of the home to show the opinion of value. And there is a form that needs to be signed 3 days prior to closing along with the closing disclosure called an appraisal valuation form. And that just tells the lender that you did get to see a copy of the appraisal prior to closing.
So lots of moving parts the last week of closing. So there's one other thing that's a best practice that we like to institute here at the Mayas Group, and it's called the final walkthrough. Okay. Normally this will take place, but the day of closing, a couple days before closing, because let's face it, when people move out of houses anymore, there's a lot of things that can happen. Okay. Like just for instance, last night, and again, I don't want to freak people out.
No. But
last night, one of my buyer's agents did a final walkthrough on a home, and the house had been vandalized.
Wow.
People, there are professionals, professional criminals, right? But I'm just going to say there are professionals out there that know that a house is empty.
Yeah.
And they know there's not a threat. So they're not going to walk in on somebody that's going to defend themselves. So a lot of times, and it's important that you do these walkthroughs, because if you don't do them and then all of a sudden you show up with your moving truck and the copper has been stolen out of the house,
that's a problem.
That's not going to be a good first impression, and that's definitely not starting the journey off the way it needs to be. But there's other things too, guys. It's making sure that the utilities are still on, right? Because you do not want to move into a house that doesn't have water, gas, or electric. Okay. Making sure the house is indeed still there, or certain repairs that may have come down to the wire are still there.
Yep.
Making sure a lot of times when people move out, washer and dryer. I mean, we've had situations where if the seller moves or somebody's moving out these washers and dryers, maybe there's damage done to the property by the movers, right? You got to make sure that we're doing these walkthroughs, and they should be done when the house is actually vacant and it's ready for turnover, right? But I can go on and on and on about things that have happened at a final walkthrough, or the things that have happened when somebody didn't do a final walkthrough.
That's it. We've seen that.
There was actually one time when there was a broker that didn't do a final walkthrough, and the seller had the movers move out the washer and dryer because the washer and dryer didn't convey with the property. Well, meanwhile, they had pulled on the area where the water line's at for the washer.
Oh no!
So the house had been leaking. That water line had been leaking for probably 4 or 5 days. And nobody had been to the house. The poor people move into that. They go and they get their keys. They move in and the ceiling's caving in because nobody ever knew. Nobody ever walked the house. So these things exist. These best practices exist for a reason. Okay.
So another thing that we do typically 2 days before closing is balance the closing disclosure. And balancing the closing disclosure has a lot to do with the title company and our closing team. And at Frost Mortgage, typically we have the documents ready to go, fully balanced, at least 24 hours before closing, just so there's no pressure put on by the title officer, by the buyer getting their cashier's check and everything else. So we always like to get things balanced, because the preliminary closing disclosure will not be the final figure you're bringing to closing until the title company balances each and every penny on this closing disclosure so that everything matches. So that's a huge important step on balancing the CD and getting your cashier's check the day of closing.
Yeah. And guys, always budget for the what ifs, right? There's so many people that will schedule the moving truck for a certain time, but things can happen. Things can happen. So I would definitely plan, moving in. One of the things that I like to advise people is plan the moving time a week after closing, just so that way you don't have any unexpected surprises, because things can happen. Sometimes sellers decide they don't want to sell at the last minute.
That's it. Yeah.
And then that happens, guys. This is real world stuff that happens. So you always want to plan accordingly, but yet you're stuck with the moving bill, a mover and a cancellation fee and this, that, and the other. So you always, and of course, we'll guide you along the way. So that's it for the week of closing, guys. Thanks for joining us for this episode. We talked about, little checklists, getting your utilities in your name. We talked about the closing disclosure and getting final figures, accurate figures, and the amount that you're going to need to bring to closing, or what you may be getting credited back at closing. We talked about all that. The importance of getting utilities in your name, not waiting till the last minute, because we've seen some bad things happen there. We also talked about the importance of re-inspections.
Absolutely.
Re-inspecting, having the inspector come back and re-inspect the items that the seller had agreed to repair for you. And we talked about the importance of the final walkthrough, right? And the fact that you always, it's better safe than sorry. A lot of people get lazy and they don't want to do these things. It's like, it's just a final walkthrough. It's no big deal. It actually is a big deal.
It is.
So we talked about that. All right. So that does it for episode number 8 of Buying a Home. Join us next week for episode 9. And that's our final episode of this series. And that's where we take you to closing. And we set some expectations about how closing is going to happen, what you need to bring to closing. Just a lot of cool stuff there to help you get totally prepared. Thank you for joining us. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you, folks. Take care.